Stanley Roberts was a tall, strongly built man, height 5 foot 11 inches, weight 13 stone 4 pounds. He was adequately nourished. The stomach showed signs of a partly digested meal with the smell of an alcoholic beverage about it. The lining of the gastric tract was chronically inflamed, and the liver showed the sort of scar tissue symptomatic of cirrhosis in its early stages. A sample of blood taken from the right arm showed a level of 278 milligrams of alcohol to 100 milliliters of blood. Physical examination showed no other further abnormalities except...
Except what,
well,
Doctor?
The left forearm showed signs of a bone that had been inadequately set after a fracture or breakage. There was a tattoo on it in the shape of a heart, pierced by an arrow with the word mother.
Dr. Dorothy Conran is in the witness box. She's the consultant pathologist at Fulchester Royal Infirmary, where she conducted an autopsy on a crane driver called Stanley Roberts. On November the 28th last year, Roberts was electrocuted when the jib of the crane that he was driving became entangled in some overhead high-voltage wires. A small boy was also killed when he ran to help Roberts. The prosecution claimed that Roberts was drunk at the time of this incident and that his employer had twice been warned that Roberts was an alcoholic who was liable to cause accidents. It is now claimed that Colin Hunter, proprietor of Albert Hunter and Company, did not take sufficient action following these warnings, and he now stands accused of failure to discharge his duty as an employer, as required by the Health and Safety Act 1974, Section 2, Subsection 1, which provides that it shall be the duty of every employer to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of all his employees.
Dr. Conran, you say that Mr. Roberts had some 200-odd milligrams of alcohol in the bloodstream. Is that correct?
278 milligrams.
278. Yes. Would you tell the court, please, what 278 milligrams of alcohol in the bloodstream represents? I mean, in layman's terms, a beer or whiskey?
I would estimate about 10 pints of beer or 20 single whiskies.
Would that have had any effect on his behaviour, would you imagine?
I would have thought so, yes. Quite an effect.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, in your opinion, and I'm sure there's no dispute about this whatsoever, and I'm sure Mr. Harvey won't mind if I beg your pardon, Mr. Harvesty won't mind if I lead on this one. Would you say, Doctor, that Mr. Roberts was drunk?
Yes, he'd be drunk.
Dr. Conran? Before you began your autopsy...
Yes?
When you first set eyes on the deceased's body...
Yes.
What were your first feelings? Your first impressions of the deceased's body?
My feelings?
Yes, you say that the deceased was a tall, strongly built man.
Yes.
Height 5 foot 11 inches, weight 13 stones 4 pounds.
That's right.
And you said he was adequately nourished.
Yes.
So you saw before you, did you not, the body of a strong, virile man in good physical condition?
Yes.
Apart, of course, from cirrhosis of the liver in its early stages, and what you say appeared to be chronic inflammation of the gastric tract.
That's right.
Now, contrary to popular belief, Dr. Conran, cirrhosis of the liver isn't only caused, is it, by excessive drinking over a long period of time?
No, there are other causes, certainly.
Such as, Doctor?
Dietary deficiency, hepatitis, virus infection. And apparently it can sometimes happen spontaneously.
Oh, you mean that cirrhosis of the liver can sometimes occur without any apparent cause at all?
It can happen.
I see. And again, if we exclude excessive drinking, could there also have been other causes that might account for this chronic inflammation of the gastric tract?
There could have been other causes, yes.
I see. So your first impressions and your subsequent detailed examination of the deceased's body didn't reveal it to be that of a man whose whole system had been ravaged by the excesses of addiction to alcohol?
No.
No. Thank you, Dr. Conran. No further questions?
Dr. Conran, this inflammation of the gastric tract, what effect would this have on Roberts were he still alive?
Were he still alive?
Yes.
He'd probably be suffering from all the symptoms of gastritis. Indigestion, abdominal discomfort, feelings of nausea, occasional bouts of vomiting.
Yes, and in your medical opinion, what would be the causes of this liver condition and the inflammation of the gastric tract?
Well, I'd have to have further details of Mr. Roberts' past history to be certain on this point, but the most likely explanation is that this is due to heavy drinking over a series of years, months.
Thank you, Doctor. And you are Mrs. Vivian Proctor of Oakwood Lane? No, I beg your pardon, Park Lodge, Oakwood Lane, yes?
I am.
And you live at that address with your son and his wife, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, now, I believe there's some new development taking place near Park Lodge.
Yes, unfortunately, there's a new housing estate.
Yes. Now, on November the 28th last year, you were walking along Oakwood Lane.
Yes, I was just returning from the village infant school with my grandson, Kenneth. I quite often used to collect him from school. It's a nice walk along the lane to the village there and back. I've always said that.
And did you see somebody in the field of Oakwood Farm?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Now, who was that, Mrs. Proctor?
Well, it was one of Hunter's workmen. They must have been clearing the fields where the old stables used to be. He was driving a crane on wheels.
And did you recognize this man driving the crane on wheels?
Yes, I did.
And who was it?
Stan. They called him Stan.
Yes, and you've since discovered that this was Mr. Stanley Roberts. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. Now, will you tell the court how you came to know Mr. Roberts?
Well, my son asked him to do some work for us.
What sort of work was that?
Well, there are a few acres of land attached to the lodge, and Kenneth, young as he is, was always pestering us to learn to play tennis. He idolizes Jimmy Connors, you know, absolutely idolizes him. So my son thought he'd have a grass tennis court laid out, and he asked this man they called Stan to level out part of the ground.
Yes, and did he?
Well, he arrived one evening when my son and daughter-in-law were rehearsing for the Fulchester Players. They did the Merry Widow again last Christmas, you know.
Ah. So you were, in fact, alone in the house?
Yes, apart from little Kenneth, of course, and he was asleep.
Yeah. When would this be, Mrs. Proctor?
Well, it was the Thursday evening.
Yes, now that's Thursday, the 20th of November.
Yes, that's right.
And would you tell the court, please, what happened on that occasion?
Well, there's rather a lovely chestnut tree at the side leading to the lodge, and I was on the phone to Mrs. Mortimer at the time, discussing the recipe for a fruitcake she wanted me to prepare for the church fund, when suddenly there was an almighty crash outside. This man they called Stan had arrived with a mechanical excavator, and he crashed straight into the chestnut tree. Well, I rushed out of the front door, and he was standing there with a glazed look in his eyes. He turned round, walked towards me, and his breath was reeking with beer. I just told him to go away.
Yes, and did he go away?
No, he said he was Anthony Quinn.
Anthony Quinn?
Yes, he started singing Zorba the Greek and wanted me to dance across the lawn with him.
Yes, I see. And what happened after that?
Well, he just fell flat on his face.
Flat on his face, I see. Please continue, Mrs. Proctor.
Well, I went back to the lodge, and soon after that he drove away. The noise had woken little Kenneth up, and I was just so angry. All this happened the Thursday evening. Well, the following Monday, after the weekend, I went down to the foreman, and I complained to him. I said they shouldn't allow alcoholics like that man to work for them, I said. He was a menace, I told him.
Mrs. Proctor, am I right in saying that this was the Friday following the Monday that you saw Stanley Roberts driving the crane in the field of Oakwood Farm?
Yes, that's right.
Now, would you... Excuse me. Would you tell the jury, please, what happened on Friday afternoon, the 28th of November?
Well, there's not much to tell, really. As I said, this man, Stan, was driving his crane across the wheels, and there are these electricity wires that run along the edge of the field. Well, he seemed to drive alongside them for several yards, when suddenly there was a huge flash and a bang. I was just so shocked, I didn't know what to do. Then he
Yes, Mrs. Proctor?
Then he jumped out of the driving seat, and as his feet touched the ground, there was another flash. He screamed and seemed to stand frozen there with his hand on the side of the crane, his mouth open and his eyes staring. He wasn't very far away from us, you see. Well, I'd taken hold of little Kenneth's hand when the first flash went, but he broke away somehow. I must have loosened my grip, or I just don't know. The next thing I remember was Kenneth climbing through the hedge and running towards the crane. I shouted at him to stop, but he just kept on running. He reached the crane, put out his hand to touch the spankles.
Mrs. Proctor, I won't trouble you much longer. I realize that all this can't have been very pleasant for you, to say the least, but I'd like to put just one small point to you to clear up. Is that all right?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. It concerns the time at which the deceased man came with the excavator and crashed into the chestnut tree. Now, you say it was Thursday evening, November the 20th. Is that right?
Yes, it must have been somewhere around about 7:30 or 8, I should imagine.
I see. So if the deceased finished work at, say, 5:30 or even 6, he would have had plenty of time to go to the pub and have a few drinks before coming along to see you.
Well, he'd had more than a few, the state he was in.
I appreciate that, Mrs. Proctor, but you would agree, wouldn't you, that nothing you've said indicates that the deceased was drinking during working hours of the day in question?
No, I suppose not.
No. So he could have had nothing to drink all day and then popped into the pub before coming along to see you.
Yes.
And it's just the circumstances surrounding the event with the chestnut tree which are the sole basis for your complaint to the site foreman that the deceased was an alcoholic and a menace?
Yes.
You have no personal knowledge at all of any other circumstance, either before or since, including the day of the tragedy, which would indicate that the deceased was an alcoholic.
Well, only what I read in the papers, of course.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Proctor.
You may stand down, Mrs. Proctor.
Now, you are Mrs. Pauline Roberts of 75 Manson Street, Fulchester.
I am.
Yes, and you work as a typist at the, I beg your pardon, a typing supervisor of the Fulchester branch of the TransPennine Insurance Company.
I do.
Yes, and you're the wife of Mr. Stanley... I beg your pardon, Mrs. Roberts. You were the wife of Mr. Stanley Roberts.
Yes.
How long had you been married, Mrs. Roberts?
Almost 10 years.
Yes.
It would have been 10 years next September.
And did you ever have cause to be concerned about your husband's health in any way?
Yes, I did.
And did you contact anybody about this worry you had?
I did.
Yes. And amongst the people you contacted, did you ever write a letter to anybody?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Now, to whom did you write?
It was Mr. Hunter.
Now, that's Mr. Colin Hunter of the Albert Hunter engineering firm of Fulchester.
Yes.
And do you recognize Mr. Hunter here in court?
No, I don't.
You don't recognize Mr. Hunter? Why don't you recognize him?
I've never met him. I wrote to him. I asked him for help. I warned him that my husband was sick, an alcoholic, and that he might have a serious accident at work because of his sickness. I thought perhaps Mr. Hunter would arrange a time to meet me and talk about my husband's illness.
Yes, did he do that, Mrs. Roberts?
No, he didn't.
But he answered your letter?
No, he didn't.
Now, Mrs. Roberts, I'm afraid since the defense is going to contest your statement that your husband was an alcoholic, I'm going to have to ask you to relate in detail the events that led up to you writing that letter to the accused, Mr. Hunter.
Well, of course, I knew when we first started going out together. I knew even then that he drank a lot. More than most people, perhaps. But I didn't really attach too much importance to it at that time. You see, he just got into the first team for Fulchester Rovers, and all that rugby league crew drank like whales on a desert island. Stan was great fun to be with. Such good company. The whole team thought a great deal of him. And we were in love.
Yes, Mrs. Roberts, well, was there a time when you started to worry about the amount your husband was drinking?
After we were married and Stan was working as a mechanic at one of the local garages. I'd always believed he had it in him to hold down a job with more social status. And I finally managed to convince him to start an evening course with Fulchester Polytechnic. At least I thought I'd persuaded him to start it.
You thought you'd persuaded him?
Well, I found out one night, quite by accident. A friend of mine had seen him in a pub the whole evening. When he told me he'd be at the Polytechnic. At first he said he'd been at a training session with the Rovers. But when I told him he'd been seen in a pub the whole evening, he switched to saying they'd been discussing tactics at the pub and what business had I to spy on him all the time. And that was when he first assaulted me.
He assaulted you?
He just went mad and hit out at me. I had a terrible black eye. I had to wear dark glasses for almost a week. And from then on, things got progressively worse as the months went by.
In what way did they get worse, Mrs. Roberts?
Well, I hardly saw any of the money he earned. It all went on drink. I was left to cope with all the household bills, the children's clothes, the mortgage, everything. And by this time, you see, he'd given up his job at the garage. He stopped going to evening school, if he ever went there in the first place. And he'd found himself work driving trucks for a construction firm. Sometimes I think he did it all to spite me.
And you say at this time he was spending a great deal of money on drink?
He was like Jekyll and Hyde. Once he'd started drinking, nothing you could say would make any sense to him. He'd quarrel over every word I spoke and tell me I was talking nonsense. I can't describe it. If you haven't lived through it, you can't know what it was like.
In the 6 months or so before he was killed, how often do you say he was coming home the worse for drink?
Every night of the week.
Every night, Mrs. Roberts?
Well, there were a few occasions. 1 or 2 nights when he'd feel remorseful and stay at home. And then we'd put the children to bed and he'd sit at my feet in front of the fire. Tell me about how he used to brush his mother's hair when he was a child. And he'd say he'd do anything to make me happy. But he didn't mean it. The drink came before me every time.
Mrs. Roberts, was there ever a time when you tried to take action to change this situation?
Endlessly. I tried to persuade him to see a doctor, but he said he didn't believe in them. He wouldn't even sign on a doctor's panel. I even plucked up enough courage on one occasion to suggest that he contacted Alcoholics Anonymous. But he went berserk when I mentioned it. He threw plates on the kitchen floor and hurled a saucepan through the window. The children cried and locked themselves in the bathroom. It took me half an hour to persuade them it was safe to come out again. But he still wouldn't agree to see anybody. He said he didn't have a drinking problem. He said I was the only problem he had.
And, Mrs. Roberts, what made you decide to write this letter to Mr. Hunter?
Well, he'd already had a couple of accidents at work. In one of them, he was quite seriously injured, after a fall from some scaffolding, I think it was. And I was worried that something even more serious might happen to him next time. I couldn't persuade him by myself to seek help anywhere. And I thought, when Mr. Hunter read my letter, that he'd talk things over with me and we might be able to work out some other way to help Stan.
Yes, that sounds reasonable, but what effect, in fact, did this letter have?
A few weeks after I posted it, Stan came home drunk and in a furious rage. He'd been called in to see Mr. Hunter and been threatened with the sack. He began hitting me again. And I was so badly bruised, I had to go to my doctor for treatment.
Did you tell the doctor that your husband had assaulted you?
No, I made up a story about an accident at home. I was too ashamed to tell him the truth.
And how did your husband react after this incident?
He was full of remorse, as usual after he'd been violent. He seemed to calm down for a while.
Thank you, Mrs. Roberts. Could the witness be shown Exhibit 1, please?
Thank you.
Now, Mrs. Roberts, is that a copy of the letter you sent to Mr. Hunter?
It is.
And this is the letter in which you warned him that your husband was an alcoholic?
It is.
Could the jury be given copies of this letter, please, Your Honour? And as usual, we're short of copies.
These are photocopies, are they, Mr. Griffiths, and not typed copies?
Yes, indeed.
Members of the jury, these are photocopies of the letter sent by Mrs. Roberts to Mr. Hunter. Since photocopying does tend to be a somewhat expensive process these days, and even the legal profession has to economize in times of inflation, I'm afraid we must ask you to share one copy between two. Now, has everyone access to a copy? Good. Very well, Mr. Griffiths.
Thank you, Your Honour. Now, Mrs. Roberts, would you please read out that letter to the court? In your own time?
Is anything the matter, Mrs. Roberts?
It's just that it seems so long ago. I'm afraid it reads as though, well, almost hysterical in tone. It's not how I intended it to be at all.
Never mind what you think of it now, Mrs. Roberts. Just read the letter out as your counsel requests. Sing out loud and clearly so that we can all hear you. Hmm?
You want me to read everything?
If you would, Mrs. Roberts.
C. Hunter Esquire, Albert Hunter and Company, Market Street, Fulchester, August 17th, 1975. Dear Mr. Hunter, you must help me. I'm at my wit's end with worry. My husband, Stanley Roberts, works for you, and he's an alcoholic, an out-and-out drunkard. God knows I've tried to reform him. I've pleaded with him to see a doctor or to make contact with Alcoholics Anonymous, but he just won't see reason. He says he doesn't have a drinking problem and that it's all my imagination. Imagination. Dear God, if only you knew. If only you could see him when he comes home drunk at night and I have to hide my face under the sheets of the bed and pretend to be asleep. He's had at least 2 accidents at work that I know about, and in one of them had his arm broken. I'm sure it's all caused by his drinking. And I'm afraid something really bad will happen to him one day. You must help me. I'm frightened. I don't want you to dismiss him from your firm or anything like that. I just want him back again, like he used to be when we were first married. Please, please help me. Yours faithfully, Pauline Roberts, Mrs.
The jury in this case is composed of members of the general public. The Queen against Hunter will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.
Mrs. Roberts,
Yes.
would you be so kind as to look now then at that letter that you have in your hand? Perhaps the jury would like to look at it again with you.
This is Mrs. Pauline Roberts, widow of a crane driver called Stanley Roberts. On November the 28th last year, Roberts was electrocuted when the jib of the crane he was driving became entangled in some overhead high-voltage wires. A small boy was also killed when he ran to help Roberts. The prosecution claimed that Roberts was drunk at the time of this incident and that his employer had twice been warned that Roberts was an alcoholic who was liable to cause accidents. One of these warnings was given in a letter from Mrs. Roberts, which has now become an exhibit in the trial. The prosecution claimed that Colin Hunter, proprietor of Albert Hunter and Company, civil engineers of Fulchester, did not take sufficient action following these warnings, and he now stands accused of failure to discharge his duty as an employer, as required by the Health and Safety Act 1974, Section 2, Subsection 1, which provides that it shall be the duty of every employer to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of all his employees.
Mrs. Roberts, this is quite a letter, isn't it?
I don't know. What do you mean?
Oh, come now, Mrs. Roberts. Look at this, out-and-out drunkard. God knows I've tried to reform him. Dear God, if only you knew. If only you could see. I have to hide my face under the sheets of the bed, pretend to be asleep. I have to happen. You must help me, I'm
Your Honour, I wonder if my learned friend could be asked to stop this ridiculous mumbling. I don't understand a word of it. I'm sure the jury don't.
Mrs. Roberts, you yourself described this letter, and I have your words written down in front of me. You described it as almost hysterical in tone. Is that right? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Almost hysterical in tone?
Yes, I said yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Roberts.
But that was still no reason for Mr. Hunter not to look into the matter thoroughly, was it?
Of course not, Mrs. Roberts. And you know, do you not, that the defendant did, in fact, look into the matter. He spoke to the deceased about it, didn't he? He showed him your letter.
Oh, yes, he did that all right.
And do you not know that the deceased said that there was very little truth in it? He said that it was all part of a campaign on your part to get him dismissed from Hunters, so that you might be able to persuade him to try for what you regarded as a more respectable position elsewhere.
Is that what he said? Doesn't surprise me.
Why doesn't it surprise you, Mrs. Roberts? Because it's the truth?
No, because it's the sort of thing Stan would say.
Do you not know that the defendant did in fact set in motion full inquiries as to the allegations in your letter, and found there to be no indication at all that the deceased was drinking at work or was indeed an alcoholic?
Well, they couldn't have been very thorough investigations, that's all I can say.
Well, do you not know that the defendant went through the deceased's work record over the past few years with a fine-tooth comb, and was extremely concerned over some disciplinary aspects, including those two accidents which she was involved in?
No, I didn't know that.
Didn't you know that he was so worried about those accidents that he insisted that the deceased should take a special test on cranes, several types of those, other plant equipment, to make sure that he was still up to the required standard for a plant operator? And he threatened him with dismissal if ever he should cause an accident in the future through contravention of company regulations.
Well, I knew he'd threatened to fire him, but I didn't know about the tests.
Do you not know that the deceased passed those tests satisfactorily?
No.
And that Mr. Hunter suggested that to put your mind at rest, perhaps the deceased should talk to the company doctor. And what do you find so amusing about that, Mrs. Roberts?
And I'll bet Stan said, yes, Mr. Hunter, of course I'll see a doctor, Mr. Hunter.
Well, yes. Yes, he did say something to that effect, as a matter of fact.
Trust him.
But wouldn't you now agree, Mrs. Roberts, that after Mr. Hunter had received your admittedly hysterical letter, the action which he then took was both full and sufficient?
I think it would have taken more than some tests and a threat of dismissal to help with my husband's problem of alcoholism.
Yeah, well, look, we'll come to the question of the alleged alcoholism in a few moments, but just for now, Mrs. Roberts, I'm right in thinking, am I not, that in your evidence a little while ago you said that after Mr. Hunter took the action that he did, the deceased seemed to calm down for a while. Now, those were the words you used, weren't they?
Yes, but it didn't last for long.
How can you possibly know that?
Well, I was living with him, wasn't I? I saw him at home every night.
Ah, yes, Mrs. Roberts, you saw him at home, but you did not see him at work, did you?
No.
No, so it's possible, isn't it, that the disciplinary action taken by Mr. Hunter had a lasting effect on the deceased during his working hours, while at home, perhaps, because of family circumstances.
Oh, you're right.
He drank a little more than you thought proper.
Stan was an alcoholic.
No.
He was sick. It wouldn't matter if he was at home or at work.
Mrs. Roberts,
he couldn't last more than a couple of hours without a drink. No amount of disciplinary action can cure an illness like that.
But, Mrs. Roberts, I have to repeat that your knowledge of the deceased's drinking is limited to what happened at home, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. You've no personal knowledge at all, have you, of how much he did or did not drink at work?
No.
No. And we're only concerned in this court with his drinking at work, aren't we?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. No. Must you keep on parroting my replies all the time? I'm agreeing with you, aren't I? Isn't that enough?
Calm yourself, Mrs. Roberts. Calm yourself. Don't allow yourself to be carried away unnecessarily. Just answer the questions as counsel puts them to you.
Thank you, Your Honour. You're a very, very complicated woman, aren't you, Mrs. Roberts?
I don't think so. Not really.
Oh, aren't you? Aren't you really? I wonder what your real reason was for writing that letter to Mr. Hunter.
It was to ask him to help me with Stan's alcoholism. I was afraid something might happen otherwise. And it did, didn't it?
Mrs. Roberts, in your position as a typing pool supervisor, you have a number of people working under you, don't you?
Yes.
You're accustomed to giving instructions to other people, aren't you?
Yes.
And you're accustomed to having those instructions carried out.
Yes.
Was the deceased happy when he was working as a garage mechanic?
I'm not sure. He might have been. It was so long ago.
Well, was he? He wasn't unhappy, was he?
No, he wasn't unhappy.
Is it not the case, Mrs. Roberts, that you wanted the deceased to bend to your will at home in the same way as you were accustomed to having your instructions carried out while you were at work?
No, that's not true. I don't think you should say that.
Yes, but look, you said in your evidence, did you not? I'd always thought he had it in him to get a better job with more social status.
Yes.
Yes. And when the deceased obtained a job with even lower social status, you said of that event, I think he did it all to spite me.
Yes.
Yes, you would have liked the deceased to have given up his job with Albert Hunter and Company and to have started training for a job with more social status, wouldn't you?
Yes.
And yet, when you wrote this letter to your husband's employer, you ended with these words, and I shall quote, I don't want you to dismiss him from your firm or anything like that. I just want him back again, like he used to be when we were first married.
I didn't know what else to do. I loved him.
Ah, yes, Mrs. Roberts, but I suggest you loved him as you wanted him to be and not as he was. I suggest that your real reason for writing to the defendant wasn't your concern over the deceased's drinking at all, was it? That was just a pretext, wasn't it?
Oh, what did you say? I'm sorry.
I'm suggesting to you, Mrs. Roberts, that if you'd really been concerned about the deceased's drinking, you would somehow or other have been able to overcome your feeling of shame and discussed it with the family doctor. I'm suggesting that what you actually wanted to do was to create a situation in which, in spite of what you say here in your letter about not wanting him to be dismissed, the deceased would be dismissed, so that you'd be able more easily to persuade him to try for a job with more social status, as you put it. So then the deceased would perhaps
Must you keep on calling him the deceased? The deceased, the deceased.
It's just a manner of speech, Mrs. Roberts.
Why
It's not
isn't he
as if
still alive? Is it my fault? Why couldn't somebody help him? Somebody.
I call Mr. William Marshall.
William Marshall. What is your religion?
Church of England.
Take the book in your right hand. Read what is on the card.
I promise before Almighty God to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Now, you are Mr. William Marshall of 23 Erpingham Road, Fulchester.
That's it.
Yes. And you work for the Albert Hunter construction firm, yes?
Yup.
Now, in what capacity are you employed, Mr. Marshall?
I'm a slinger.
A what? A slinger?
That's it.
If I might interrupt you for just one moment, Mr. Marshall, are you chewing gum? As I say, I don't wish to appear in the least patronizing, but I wonder when you give your evidence to the court, if you would avoid the temptation to which we so often find people in occupations such as yours, or somewhat susceptible, namely the utilization of trade jargon such as slingers or slashers or cowboys or similar nomenclature, which, though colourful and doubtless descriptively accurate, nevertheless have to be explained at tedious lengths to the jury, and this results in the consumption of an inordinate amount of court time which might usefully be allocated to other cases. Simple language, Mr. Marshall, will suffice.
All right.
Yeah. Very well, Mr. Griffiths. Let us return to your muttons.
Thank you, Your Honour. Saving the court so much time. Mr. Marshall, what exactly is your job as a slinger?
A slinger slings for the crane driver, like, make sure that what's being moved, like, is secured properly. You know what I mean? To the chain that hangs down from jib, like.
So you worked with Mr. Roberts?
That's it.
Now, were you working with him on the afternoon of November the 28th when this crane he was driving became entangled in the overhead electricity wires?
Nope.
Was anyone working with him then?
Nope. We weren't working in that field, like, nobody's supposed to be working in that field like then.
What, not even Mr. Roberts?
Nope.
Why do you think Mr. Marshall Roberts ventured into that field on that afternoon?
Well, he was drunk, like, wasn't he?
Oh, how do you mean?
How do you know he was drunk, Mr. Marshall, if you weren't with him?
Well, I'd seen him come back from boozer at dinner time.
Was he drunk then?
Hey, should have seen him. He said he's going to get his head down for a kip.
I see.
Mr. Marshall, how long have you known Mr. Roberts?
Stan, ever since he first came to work for Mr. Hunter, about 5 years since, something like that.
Yes, you acquainted with him before he came to Hunter's, were you?
Not to talk to, like. I'd seen him play.
You'd seen him play?
In rugby league. He was a fullback for Fulchester Rovers. I'd always admired him. I mean, some of the things he could do on that park stopped just short of being a ruddy masterpiece. He'd come up from fullback to make the extra three-quarter, like. I mean, see him in slow motion with brass band playing poet and peasant, you'd think he was something out of Russian ballet.
So, you and Mr. Roberts were close friends, were you?
Not really, like. He was a bit moody. You had to be careful how you put things to him, especially since he left Rovers.
Now, when would that be, Mr. Marshall?
About 3 years since. He kept having days off, like. I mean, don't play like Stan did, like without some duff bagger trying to duff you up sooner or later. Then he chucked it in. I mean, nobody knew why, except some of the lads thought his missus were getting at him, like. There you go. And he still kept having days off.
Yeah, what did you think the significance of that was?
Well, he still kept having days off, like, without a doctor's note. I mean, you see him in the morning, wincing with pain as the phantom pile drivers went battering into his skull. He said it was something wrong with his stomach, but we all knew what was wrong with him, like. Sometimes he'd disappear for half an hour or more, and he'd come back and he'd be all stinking and sick and vomit, you know what I mean? And then he had those two accidents, like one when he turned over a dumper on a steep gradient, the other time when he fell down a hoist and broke his arm. I warned him, but he didn't take no notice, like.
You warned him?
Yes, I said he couldn't keep on drinking like that and get away with it forever.
I see. Now, did he...
Yes, Mr. Harvesty, quite. Mr. Marshall, are you saying you knew Roberts was drinking heavily at this time?
Of course I did. I was working with him. I mean, not on have it for 10 odd years without getting to know signs.
How much did he drink?
It's hard to say, like. You know, if I was with him, like, for any time, for any length of time, like, of an evening, I mean, he'd get through 7 or 8 pints easy.
As much as that.
Well, it's not counting whiskey chasers.
And did this happen during the day as well?
Like I say, he was always late back from boozer at dinner time.
Lunch, you mean?
That's what I said, dinner time.
Yes, and did you warn your employers that they had a heavy drinker on their payroll?
Must be joking.
I assure you, Mr. Marshall, I am not joking. Why did you not inform your employers what you knew in relation to Robert's drinking?
Well, he'd have got pushed, wouldn't he? Straight up road, no trouble.
I see. And is this sort of covering up for drinking at work normal practice in your occupation, Mr. Marshall?
Well, no more than usual, I shouldn't imagine. I mean, I expect you get through a fair amount of booze in bar here at dinner time. I mean, like when you're at Navy, though, and there's a break, I mean, it's down pie for a pub for pie and pint, I mean.
Oh, yes, I see. No doubt you'll be able to cover these points during your cross-examination, Mr. Harvesty.
I hope I shall.
Very well, then, Mr. Griffiths.
Now, Mr. Marshall, I'd like you to think very carefully about this. Did anybody at Hunter's ever ask you whether you thought Roberts had a drinking problem?
You mean police, like?
No,
trouble
as I said, at Hunter's. I mean, like the foreman or ganger, anybody like that ever ask you if you thought Roberts was an alcoholic?
Alcoholic? No, never.
So no one actually ever asked you if you thought he had a drinking problem?
No, they didn't, but like I said, I wouldn't have told him out any road.
Yes, as you say, because you feared he might get dismissed.
Yes, or threatened with it. I mean, when Stan's missus wrote that letter, like, and Don, you know, Don Wilkins, the foreman, come across and spoke to Stan, he made him do all those tests. He should have seen it. Tests on dumpers, tests on dozers, tests on cranes. It was like Ruddy Olympics.
So how did Mr. Roberts behave after he'd taken these tests?
Oh, for a couple of weeks he quietened down a bit.
Yes, and then what happened?
Well, he back to normal, like.
And were you present on this occasion when the complaint was lodged about Roberts, about his drinking?
Oh, yes, lady come across from Park Lodge and spoke to Don, you know, Don about something that Stan had got up to.
Yes, what was that?
Well, Stan had been doing a foreigner for one night and he crashed his mechanical excavator into a conker tree.
And was he drunk at the time?
Oh, yes, all over the place, according to lady.
And do you know what course of action was taken after this complaint?
He's given push, wasn't he?
It was dismissed.
That's it.
Yes, now, Mr. Marshall, can you remember when Roberts was told of his dismissal?
Straight away, same day.
Yes, the same day as what?
The same day as he crashed into overhead wires. Don Wilkins come across special like. We were working in the morning to give him glad tidings.
I see. So, Mr. Wilkins told Roberts of his dismissal in the morning, and at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, this fatal accident occurred.
That's it.
So the line of disciplinary action taken by Hunters and culminating in Roberts' dismissal, far from ensuring Mr. Roberts' health, safety and welfare, in fact precipitated his death.
Just one moment, Mr. Marshall. I'd like to clear up one little point.
Oh, sorry. You carry on like.
That's very kind of you. When you spoke so eloquently just now of Roberts wincing with pain as the phantom pile drivers went battering into his skull, you were talking, I assume, of the effects of a perfectly ordinary common or garden hangover, were you not?
Yep.
And the alcoholic beverages which caused this hangover were consumed the night or evening before, wouldn't you say?
All right, aye.
So the signs of a hangover don't prove that a man's been drinking heavily at work during the previous day, do they?
Nope.
No. Now then, Mr. Marshall, when you were questioned by His Honour, you said that on the occasions you drank with Roberts, it was nothing for him to get through 7 pints of beer and an unspecified quantity of whiskey chasers of an evening, didn't you?
Nope.
No?
I didn't say 7 pints. 7 or 8 pints is what I said.
Yes, but you did say of an evening and not during the day, did you not, Marshall?
All right, aye.
So what evidence do you have that Roberts was drinking heavily during the day?
Well, like I say, it was
Well,
always...
did he, for example, bring bottles of beer to work with him to drink during the morning?
No, nothing like that, no.
Did he carry a hip flask with him to top himself up with whiskey or even brandy in the day?
I can't remember that, no.
And I suppose he didn't send out to the nearest pharmacist for a regular supply of methylated spirits?
Nope.
So that if Roberts was drinking during his working day, that would just leave the lunch break, wouldn't it?
Yep.
Yes, how much did he drink then, Mr. Marshall?
Well, like I say, I mean, Stan was a bit of a loner, like. He'd knock off early, he'd go into Fulchester at one of the boozers there and come back late.
But you didn't go with him?
Nope.
So you just assumed that he's spent that time drinking, did you, Mr. Marshall?
Well, I didn't think he was feeding birds in park, like.
Yes, but you have no proof that Roberts was to spend every lunch break drinking in a pub in Fulchester.
Well, like I say, he was always late back and his breath was smelling of booze.
Yes, but you couldn't tell whether he'd had too much to drink on those occasions or whether he'd just had a pie and a pint like you or anybody else for that matter. No, all you can say is that he was late back from lunch and his breath smelled of beer. Well, on the other hand, we do know that Roberts was drunk on one occasion, don't we? One afternoon, the afternoon he met his death. On that occasion, there was a special reason for his being drunk, wasn't there? Because it was the morning prior to that afternoon that Roberts had been told of his dismissal. Isn't that so?
Aye.
Did you speak to Roberts after his dismissal?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. What sort of mood would you say he was in at that time?
He's quite cheerful, really.
Oh, he was cheerful.
Oh, yes, that was the thing about Stan. I mean, you never knew how he was going to react. He said not to take no notice what Don Wilkins had said. He didn't think Mr. Hunter would fire him.
Really?
He thought he could get him to change his mind before the end of the week, before his notice ran out.
Well, now, did he give any indication as to how he was intending to get Mr. Hunter to change his mind?
Yes, he said he was going to give up drink, like, and prove he could do the work of 10 men.
And then what did he do?
Well, he went into Fulchester like he always did at dinner break, and he come back drunk.
Ah, yes, on this particular occasion, he did come back drunk. We do know that. But I put it to you, Mr. Marshall, that this was an unusual, possibly exceptional circumstance. Now, when Mrs. Roberts wrote her letter to the defendant, there was no instant dismissal of her husband then, was there?
Not straight away, no.
No. There was a test, wasn't there, to see whether he was still fit and competent to continue driving a crane. Did you know that the defendant also suggested that Roberts might consult the company doctor?
No, I didn't know that, no.
No? And even when the defendant was finally forced to dismiss Roberts, that decision wasn't taken lightly, was it? Not until all reasonably practicable avenues had been explored, one might almost say exhausted, to ensure Roberts's health, safety, and welfare at work. No further questions.
Mr. Marshall, this dismissal of Roberts, do you think that was the right action for Hunters to have taken?
Well, right or wrong, I mean, he didn't have no option, did he? Not with 2 complaints like that.
So you think there was no other course of action they could have taken?
What like?
Well, I don't know. We've heard that Mr. Hunter was reasonable and practicably suggested that Roberts ought to consult a doctor. And I've also found this leaflet here. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. I noticed that people like Roberts with that sort of problem should take compulsory sick leave on full pay to receive medical or psychiatric treatment.
Well, I mean, they don't, do they? I mean, if they find out you're drinking, you just give them boot like.
The jury in this case is composed of members of the general public. The Queen against Hunter will be concluded tomorrow in the Crown Court.
What is your religion?
Church of England.
You take the book in your right hand, read what is on the card.
I promise before Almighty God to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
This is Mr. Colin Hunter, proprietor of Albert Hunter and Company's Civil Engineers of Fulchester. On November the 28th last year, one of his employees, a crane driver called Stanley Roberts, was electrocuted when the jib of a crane he was driving became entangled with some overhead high-voltage wires. A small boy was also killed when he ran to help Roberts. The prosecution claimed that Roberts was drunk at the time of this incident and that Colin Hunter had twice been warned that Roberts was an alcoholic who was liable to cause accidents. One of these warnings was given in a letter from Mrs. Roberts, the widow of the dead crane driver. The prosecution claimed that Colin Hunter did not take sufficient action following these warnings, and he now stands accused of failure to discharge his duty as an employer, as required by the Health and Safety Act of 1974, Section 2, Subsection 1, which provides that it shall be the duty of every employer to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of all his employees.
Wife. Did you know Roberts before you received that letter from his wife?
Yes, I interviewed him myself when he first joined the firm some 5 years ago, and I've spoken to him on several occasions since then. We've a family business, and I hope we manage to keep things that way. I found Roberts to be an able workman, even-tempered, seemed to get on very well with his fellow workmates, the sort of man that women might describe as the strong, silent type.
Yes, I see. Now, when you read this letter for the first time, what did you think?
Well, I thought it must be a case of mistaken identity.
Really? How is that?
Well, the man described by Mrs. Roberts in the letter was nothing like the man known to me as Roberts.
Well, did you form any other impressions after you'd read the letter?
Yes, I formed the impression that the woman who'd written it must be ill. Neurotic, hysterical, something of that nature.
Tell us now, if you will, if you took any action after reading the letter.
Well, of course I did. There's no ignoring letters like that. We're not the unacceptable face of capitalism at Hunter's, you know. We take our responsibility towards our employees very seriously indeed.
So, what action did you take?
Well, I got in touch with Wilkins, the general foreman at the Oakwood estate where Roberts was working, and I asked him what the hell was going on out there.
And what did Wilkins have to say on the matter?
Well, he told me that as far as he knew, there was no question of drink connected with Roberts. No? Not at work, at any rate. He said that he was inclined to be somewhat temperamentally unpredictable on occasions, and that he'd been involved in 2 accidents in the past year or so.
Were you satisfied with Mr. Wilkins' reply?
No, I was not. I told him I wanted Roberts brought in to see me at the Double. I wanted to find out what had happened to this man since I last saw him.
And did you notice any change in him?
No, not a bit of it. I showed him his wife's letter. He laughed. He said it was all a load of nonsense. He said he thought it was part of his wife's campaign to get him to leave Hunter's for a job elsewhere.
What else was said?
Well, we had quite a heart-to-heart chat after that. I explained to him that I got nothing against drink as such, and that what he did in his own private life was entirely his affair. I did suggest, however, that he might see the company doctor, if it would help put his wife's mind at rest about what she seemed to regard as a drinking problem. I then told him that as he had a very bad work record, absenteeism, bad timekeeping, etc., I was going to arrange for him to take a test to make sure that he was still a proficient plant operator. I then asked him if he was fully familiar with the company's policy statement on safety.
Yes, now, what is that exactly, Mr.
That's a small booklet we have printed. I think I've got one here somewhere. Yes, here we are. We've had a lot of these run off. Safety Precautions in Civil Engineering, a handbook for all employees of Albert Hunter and Company. Now, every employee was issued with a copy of this, and I made it quite clear to Roberts that if there was any contravention of this code of safety practice, he'd find himself down at the Labour Exchange faster than you could say Anthony Wedgwood Ben.
How did he take all this?
Oh, he took it quite calmly. He said that he'd take my advice, that he would consult someone, and that he was very happy working for Hunters. I then asked him if he thought it was necessary for me to reply to his wife's letter. He said no. He'd deal with that matter himself. Then we had a cigarette, a glass of port, discussed the fortunes of Fulchester Rovers in this year's Cup. He was a fine fullback, you know. Marshall was quite right on that point. Then we shook hands and off he went. I subsequently heard that he passed the test quite satisfactorily.
But did you hear anything else about Roberts after that?
Oh, indeed, yes. Last November, Wilkins informed me that a lady by the name of Mrs. Proctor had complained that Roberts had damaged a tree of hers with a mechanical excavator and that he was drunk at the time.
And did you take any action?
Yes, I told Wilkins to dismiss him immediately, with whatever period of notice, of course, was customary.
Did you have any doubts about dismissing Roberts at all?
No, I felt that I'd bent over backwards to help the man, that he'd betrayed my trust in him, and as far as I was concerned, that was the end of the matter.
But you were satisfied, were you, that you had fulfilled your duty as an employer towards Roberts's health and safety at work?
Oh, yes. My conscience is entirely clear on that point. In fact, if I may just read this to you.
Yes? Is my learned friend intending to introduce this booklet as an exhibit, Your Honour?
Are you, Mr. Harvey?
It was not my intention, Your Honour, but I suppose if Mr. Hunter wishes to refer to it...
in any event, I might like to just glance at it for a couple of moments.
Are there any copies, Mr. Harvey?
One moment, Your Honour. Do we have a copy here? Are you sure you want this as well?
I'd simply want to glance at it.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hunter. Please continue.
Thank you, Your Honour. The very first paragraph in our company's policy statement on safety gives some idea of my own personal view on this very important subject. Albert Hunter Limited regard with great seriousness the requirement under the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act that it shall be the duty of every employer to ensure, so far as it is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of all his employees.
Mr. Hunter, thank you. We finish with the book?
Yeah, just a moment. Now, Mr. Hunter, I've got various scribblings and pamphlets and notes here that if you'll bear with me, Mr. Hunter, seem to have got in a bit of a mess. We'll take them as they come, shall we? All roads lead to Rome, as they say. Now, you must forgive me for asking such a naive question to begin with, but in your experience, have you ever had any accidents on your firm as a result from drunkenness or alcoholism?
As a matter of policy, there's an investigation of all accidents which take place at Hunter's. And apart from this one instance, there hasn't yet been an occasion where drink has been found to be a contributory factor.
Jolly good. Now, you're probably aware of various press reports on alcoholism in Great Britain. The numbers range from some 400,000 to 500,000. And you'll probably agree with me that not all alcoholics are dirty little tramps drinking cheap red biddy. I mean, quite a lot of them are in full-time employment, yes?
Some of them, perhaps, yes.
More than some, Mr. Hunter, I assure you. I've got a leaflet here, the annual report of the Merseyside, Lancashire, Cheshire Council on alcoholism. And this gives a list of various occupations and professions of some 3,000 alcoholics that have come along to these people for help. Now, this list is absolutely enormous. I mean, there's people like doctors, solicitors, airline pilots, train drivers, labourers, nurses. Strangely enough, Your Honour, there's no judges or barristers on this list.
We must be thankful for small mercies, mustn't we, Mr. Griffith?
Yes, indeed, Your Honour. I do notice, however, a back copy of the Times, there's a little headline that says, "Doctor tells of judges with drink troubles." You read the Times, Mr. Hunter?
Yes, I do.
And do you remember reading the Times on the 22nd of September last?
Oh, probably. I can't say definitely.
And do you remember reading an article on alcoholism that from one sample of alcoholics, 70% of them were in full-time employment?
Yes, I do remember reading that, as a matter of fact.
So perhaps you'll also remember that 11% of those alcoholics were certain that drinking had been entirely responsible for accidents at work.
Yes, I believe there was something to that effect in the report.
Yes, and in spite of this fact, Mr. Hunter, you still maintain that you've had no previous accidents with your firm as a result from drunkenness.
No, we haven't.
Mr. Hunter, how on earth can you be sure of this?
Well, short of giving a breathalyzer test to anyone involved in an accident, and catch the unions wearing that one, incidentally, you can't be absolutely sure, can you?
No, unless somebody dies after an accident and there's traces of alcohol in the bloodstream, and it's all a bit late, isn't it? See, this is my problem, Mr. Hunter. Here you are, a man sufficiently concerned with safety within his firm that he brings out this pretty little red booklet, and yet you receive a letter from the wife of one of your employees asking for help and warning you that her husband is an alcoholic. And this doesn't ring any bells in your safety-conscious brain?
Well, of course it did. I took the matter very seriously indeed. I made all the inquiries I thought fit and proper.
What, you called your foreman in and asked him what was going on?
That's right.
And you didn't think it necessary to check with any of Robert's workmates?
No, I always deal with matters of discipline at work through employees in a supervisory position.
I see, so the inquiries you thought fit and proper amount solely and simply to you just having a little chat with your foreman, Mr. Wilkins.
I also called for Robert's work record from personnel, and I spoke to the man himself, don't forget.
Ah, yes, now this work record. Does absenteeism bother you at all, Mr. Hunter?
Absenteeism?
Yes, I believe a few moments ago you said that Robert's drinking was not affecting his work. Well, I mean, surely it was affecting his work. He wasn't turning up for it, was he?
On some occasions, no, I grant you that. But that was
Yes, thank
mainly
you, Mr.
Monday
Hunter.
morning absenteeism, and I'm afraid that's something most firms find they have to live with.
Mr. Hunter, perhaps you'll also grant me that this occasion of absenteeism might have been a very good reason to go and have a little chat with Mrs. Roberts.
No.
Well, you could have talked to her about her husband's drinking problems at home.
No, I disagree.
But plainly it was affecting the productivity of your firm. I mean, don't you have some kind of responsibility to your shareholders?
We've a family business, Your Honour. We don't have shareholders.
Oh, well, you're bank manager then.
No, I don't think so. You must remember that when Roberts was playing rugby, he was often away from work due to injury. Now, I'm not a Stalinist dictator. I can't tell a man what he should do in his spare time. I can't say you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't play rugby. It might affect my productivity. I mean, where would it all end?
Oh, Mr. Hunter, come on. I mean, no one's accusing you of being a Stalinist dictator. What we are concerned with here today is whether you took the action required of you by law as an employer, aren't we?
Yes.
Yes, now to this end, Mr. Hunter, I may be wrong, often am. I made a little note earlier that your counsel in cross-examining Mrs. Roberts claims that you went through Roberts' work record with a fine tooth comb. Did you do that?
Yes, I went through it very thoroughly.
I see. And did you have this work record in front of you when you were interviewing Roberts?
I did.
And were these two accidents that he was involved in mentioned in the report?
They were indeed.
And was his bad timekeeping?
Yes.
And were the reasons given for the absenteeism at all?
There's always some sort of reason, isn't there?
Well, in this case, Mr. Hunter, was there a reason?
Some sort of stomach trouble, if I remember correctly.
I see. And you knew from your talk with the foreman that Roberts was inclined to be somewhat temperamentally unpredictable.
That was another factor, of course.
Yes, and you also knew from Mrs. Roberts' letter that there was a great deal of trouble at home.
Yes.
I've got a leaflet here which is put out by the Fulchester Council on Alcoholism, the alcoholic in employment. And it contains a list of symptoms by which employers might recognize the possibility of one of their employees either being or becoming an alcoholic. And featured prominently on this list are these items: absenteeism, stomach trouble, overlong lunch breaks, accidents at work, changeable or depressed moods, and marital difficulties. You familiar with this publication, Mr. Hunter?
No, I'm not.
But I was led to believe that you are a trustee of the Fulchester Council for Social Services.
Yes, I am.
And does not that Council for Social Services put a lot of money into the Fulchester Council on Alcoholism?
Yes, but you must remember that copies of publications from organisations that we fund aren't always automatically sent to trustees.
Are they not? I'd suggest another possibility to you, Mr. Hunter. I'd suggest that this leaflet was probably sent to you, but because you were so convinced that you had no alcoholics on your books at your firm, you probably afforded this leaflet a cursory glance and filed it carefully away in the wastepaper basket.
I doubt if that would have happened.
Well, having read out those items to you, Mr. Hunter, perhaps you'd agree with me that you might not possibly be the best person in the world to judge whether one of your employees was or was not an alcoholic.
I did suggest to Roberts that he should consult the company doctor.
Just a suggestion.
Well, you can't force a man to see a doctor against his will.
You could have made it a condition of his continued employment that he seek medical advice, couldn't you?
Unless you have pretty positive evidence that the man was an alcoholic, you'd have great difficulties getting that one past the union as well.
Oh, so many difficulties, Mr. Hunter, and all of them insuperable. Is that it?
What do you mean?
Look, in your view, it wasn't a reasonably practicable step to consult Mrs. Roberts because she'd written you an hysterical letter, a letter which Roberts regarded as a load of nonsense. It wasn't a reasonably practical step to consult Roberts' work fellows because they'd only lie and cover up for him. And you'd also heard from your foreman that there was no drink troubles with Roberts at work. And now you're trying to tell me it wasn't a reasonably practical step to send him off to see a doctor because of union difficulties. Oh, it must be terribly tough at the top, Mr. Hunter.
I was concerned, above all, for the safety of Roberts and the safety of his fellow workmates. I warned him that any contravention of this code of safety practice would result in disciplinary action being taken.
Alcoholism is a sickness. How can you possibly treat a sick man with disciplinary action? Do you not agree you should have gone further to carry out your obligations under the law for the wealth, for the welfare, the safety, and the health of one of your employees?
Indeed, yes, and that is why I made absolutely certain, by means of a strenuous proficiency test, that Roberts was fit and competent to carry on work as a crane driver.
Yes, but Mr. Hunter, I mean, this is the problem with alcoholics. That chap might have dried out to take your tests. I mean, what would happen the next day or the next week or the next month?
Well, that's a hypothetical question, I'm afraid.
Exactly, Mr. Hunter, and that is why I put it to you. You did not take all reasonably practical steps to protect that worker. You should have tested the hypothesis that Roberts might have been an alcoholic. You've been warned on 2 occasions.
Are you seriously suggesting that I should keep an eye on all my employees, just in case some of them might turn out to be alcoholics?
What I'm suggesting, Mr. Hunter, is this booklet which you brought out, which, try as I might, I can find no information whatsoever about the possible dangers of people drinking at work, should have been combined with this leaflet, The Alcoholic in Employment. Because it is only if your firm has a policy for the health and welfare of alcoholics that we can be certain you also have a policy for the safety of them in that respect.
Your Honour, I think what is now being suggested is somewhat idealistic and speculative, to say the least. In business, we have to deal with what is reasonably practicable within the course of everyday working possibilities. Within that context, I can only say I did everything in my power to help Roberts.
Did you, Mr. Hunter? His dismissal didn't help him over much, did it? A few hours after you gave him the push, he was dead, wasn't he? And an innocent child was killed at the same time.
Members of the jury, in nearly all criminal cases, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. But in cases of this sort, Parliament has specifically provided that the burden of proof is on the defence. Now, the prosecution case is that the accused should have taken the matter more seriously when he received Mrs. Roberts' letter alleging that the deceased was an alcoholic whose drinking might cause an accident at work. The prosecution say that having regard to the deceased's overall work record, he should not have accepted so readily the deceased's explanation or the site foreman's assessment, that he should have made sure that other employees were questioned about the deceased, that he should have put more pressure on the deceased to consult the company doctor, and lastly, that he should have taken the trouble to see Mrs. Roberts. The defence, on the other hand, say that having regard to Roberts' explanation and the information given by the foreman, the accused took all reasonably practicable steps to ensure that the deceased was fit and competent to pursue his normal employment, and that he cannot be criticized for deciding not to pry in the deceased's private life. Now, having considered these points, you must now decide whether the defense has proved, on the balance of probabilities, that the steps taken by the accused when he received Mrs. Roberts' letter were in fact all the steps that were reasonably practicable in the circumstances. Will you now retire, elect a foreman to speak for you when you return, and consider your verdict?
All stand. Now, foreman, please stand. Now, just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
Yes.
And do you find the defendant, Colin Hunter, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Your Honor?
Colin Hunter, you are free to go.